All right. So, good evening, everybody. And a book came out within the last few weeks by a writer named Emily Tamkin. And the book is called Bad Jews, something like Explorations in American Jewish Identity. And it made quite a splash. I would say that. I saw a lot of reviews of it. And so I was going to say I picked up a copy, but it's an intangible. I actually got it on Kindle, so I don't know if you even pick that up. But I bought it on Kindle, and I read it, and I'm going to start off by saying that the book was not as good as I hoped it would be. It was, I don't know. I'm not saying don't read it. I mean, if it interests you, then certainly read it. But I found the book a little disappointing. But since it did get widely reviewed, it gave me the thought of kind of discussing the thesis that it raises and the questions that it asks. And normally for those of you who participate in this class, either regularly or occasionally, I do a lot of talking. And then occasionally you'll ask a question or make a comment or whatever. But I want to start off instead by asking a question. Okay, so when you hear the term bad Jew, who or what do you think of? Yeah, Sue.
Well, I was kind of thinking about this since I got your email the other day about the class.
Right.
And it doesn't say bad person, it says bad Jew. So
Right.
in that respect, I think that it's someone that reflects badly by their behavior and example on the whole Jewish people, like somebody that we would almost be embarrassed to be part of, and the opposite would reflect to me a good Jew.
All right, that's really, really interesting, because there is this halachic category of Chilul Hashem, right? And Chilul Hashem literally means desecration of God's name. Okay, but what does Chilul Hashem mean? It's exactly what you said. Somebody who, by their behavior, embarrasses the entire Jewish people, right? Now, all right, so they embarrass the Jewish people. What does that have to do with God, right? So if you've got a Jew who behaves in a disgraceful way and is a person who is sort of like known to be a Jew, right? I mean, if it's somebody named John Smith, right? Certainly there are Jews named John Smith, I suppose, but nobody would automatically rush to the conclusion that John Smith was a Jew, right? So therefore, not necessarily Chilul Hashem, right? But somebody like Bernie Madoff, right? That's a Chilul Hashem, right? That's a desecration of God's name. Now, why do we consider that a desecration of God's name? I mean, what does this have to do with God? It's human beings. Yeah, Marilyn. By the way, you can all, I mean, if you don't have background noise, keep your mic unmuted. That's fine. It's a small enough group.
Well, on the umbrella of Jews as the chosen people, you would think that if God chooses a group, that they should behave in a godly manner, and he certainly did not.
Right. No, that's exactly right. Like, we are God's representatives, right? We are God's representatives, and people optimally should look at us and they say, these people represent God well, right? As an example, that's nothing to do with Bernie Madoff or something, okay? But some of you, particularly those of you who are into law or halakha, may find it interesting. Okay, so I'll give you two different examples. One that is much more theoretical, and one that is something that every congregational rabbi runs into every now and then. Okay. So if a non-Jewish brother and sister both convert to Judaism, right, in pure legal theory, they could marry each other. Okay, now why could they marry each other in pure legal theory? Because according to halakha, a convert is considered a newborn baby. All right, it's like being born again, but taking it quite literally. Okay, so a brother and sister who both converted are now no longer brother and sister legally. So in pure legal theory, they could marry each other, but we don't allow it. Okay, aside from the fact that it would be illegal, everywhere but like Mississippi or Kentucky. We don't allow it halachically. Why don't we allow it halachically? Because it'd be a chilul Hashem, right? Judaism allows a brother and sister to marry each other. That would be a desecration of God's name, right? Because go explain that. Well, they're not really brother and sister, okay? But a related question, right? A convert loses a parent, right? Do they sit shiva for them? Do they say Kaddish for them? Right? Again, in pure legal theory, the answer is actually no. Right? Because once you've converted, your parents are no longer your parents. If your siblings are no longer your siblings, your parents are no longer your parents. Right? But again, a rabbi telling somebody, don't mourn your parent, right? It's a chilul Hashem. They say, oh, when I was Catholic, I had to respect my parents, but now that I'm Jewish, I don't. Right? It's untenable, right? So we rule in a way that contravenes black letter law, precisely so that we don't engage in chilul Hashem, desecration of God's name, right? So that's a category that we take very seriously. Mike.
So I'm just surprised at what you're saying. I would have thought, although I haven't any personal knowledge of the Talmud, but I would have thought that the sages back then would have given this short shrift, saying, well, but we consider a convert to be newborn, but that's strictly spiritually, and that it doesn't cut ties, for example, with parents or change the relationship with the sister. I would have thought that they would have discussed that in one paragraph and moved on.
Well, it is discussed, and there are other opinions, okay? Because there's a question of, right? So and I don't want to get bogged down because this is completely a tangent, okay? Although, right, if you've taken Talmud class, you know tangents are the heart of the Talmud, right? The obligation of procreation, true urvu, be fruitful and multiply, right? So there is a discussion about whether a convert who already has children, do we say they fulfilled the obligation of procreation, or do they have to start over? Right? Precisely for the same reason, right? Because if you convert, right, if your parents are not your parents and your siblings are not your siblings, your kids are not your kids either, right? It's a machlok, it's a disagreement. There are some rabbis in the Talmud who say it doesn't count, and some who say, well, obviously it does. He's got kids, right? But I mean, the bottom line, it doesn't really matter because the black letter law says one thing, but practical halakha says another, right? And the question of how we get there, I think, is actually less important. All right. So, bad Jew, somebody who brings the Jewish people into disrepute. Anybody else want to take a crack at what a bad Jew means? Nobody else? Yeah, Toby. You need to unmute.
Well, if you were to ask an Orthodox person what a bad Jew is, I think they would say anyone who doesn't observe Shabbat, who doesn't keep kosher, who doesn't follow the rules very strictly as written in the Torah.
Yeah, I mean, it would depend who you ask. Okay, I
Right.
mean, there certainly is that perspective. However, I mean, and this is a book that I read when I was still in rabbinical school. Okay, so over 36 years ago. All right, because there's this conversion controversy, right? I mean, if somebody converts under my supervision, I have a sort of ethical obligation to point out to them that most of the Orthodox world will not accept this as a valid conversion, right? And why? Because according to the normative halachic understanding in the Orthodox world, I'm not qualified to serve on a Beit Din. I'm essentially not qualified to be a witness, right? Nobody here is qualified to be a witness because we are not fully observant according to Orthodox standards, right? And you have to have Edim Kesherim, or people who are Ksherim Ladun, kosher witnesses. Okay, but Eliezer Berkovitz, who was a very well-respected Orthodox rabbi among the non-Orthodox, less so among the Orthodox, in his book, Not in Heaven, the Nature and Function of Halakha, said that doesn't apply anymore. He said, 500, 1,000, 1,500 years ago, you could assume that a person who wasn't fully observant was not an honest and ethical person, right? Because the two went hand in hand, communal pressure and so on and so forth. Because today we all know this, right? Every Orthodox Jew has non-Orthodox friends who are absolutely honest and ethical people, right? And the qualification to be a witness is, can we trust that this person is telling the truth when they testify? And Berkovitz says there's no reason to disqualify non-Orthodox Jews as invalid witnesses, as long as they're honest and ethical people, and which they mostly are, right? So Berkovitz certainly would not have said that I am a bad Jew or you are a bad Jew, right? But many Orthodox people would. So that's one definition. Okay, any others about being a bad Jew? Okay, well, yeah, Mike.
I guess when I was a kid, it was really made clear to me when you read the paper and somebody did something wrong and was in the paper, the first thing my mom would say was, "Thank God he's not Jewish."
Right.
And the reason was because their generation, my parents' generation, remembered all too well the anti-Semitism that was not so latent at the time and that they ran from originally. And so they worried about that because they were not mentally assimilated, and they did not want somebody, a Jew, to reflect badly on Jews. And it had nothing to do with halakha or that person's obligations in Judaism, other than to, as you said, be God's representative and act like it. And it was really clear. Is all I can say is that we wouldn't be having this discussion 70 years ago.
Right. I mean, the phrase they probably used was a shanda for the goy, right? Which is not particularly different than from what Seuss, right? My perspective on that is that that's irrational. That Jews cause anti-Semitism by virtue of existence, perhaps, right? But not by anything that they actually do, right? Because Jews are all communists and they run the world financial situation, right? I mean, whatever. Jews are all ultra liberals and they're neoconservatives who get America into endless overseas wars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? I mean, anti-Semitism is not rational and it's not caused by anything that Jews do, right? And therefore it can't be solved by Jews, right? It can only be solved by non-Jews. But I do understand, and that's kind of what you said, in the sense that they weren't, I don't remember exactly the phrase that you used, but they weren't acclimated to living, in a democratic, pluralistic society the way that we are. Okay, so the term good Jew, what does that mean? Yeah, Sue, again.
Well, I think that would be, pardon me, the exact opposite. It would be somebody that you would look at who would bring, be a good example for other Jews, a good example for Jewish kids, somebody that would reflect well, on Jews in general, and the Jewish religion and all of that.
Right, and therefore, by extension, on God. Right? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Marilyn.
I think it's a different term entirely. When a guy says, "Oh, he's a good Jew," they mean
Exactly what I was.
that
Not
you're
like
the
those.
exception.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. Not like those.
Mhm.
Right. Sure. Sure. It certainly can be, right? I mean, because one of the things that Tamkin pointed out in this book is that apparently even Henry Ford had a close Jewish friend. I didn't know that, but you can be an anti-Semite and still have Jewish friends. I mean, you can be an anti-Semite and perhaps have a Jewish daughter and a Jewish son. But then the answer would be, well, Jews are this way, but you're not like those Jews, right? Or you're an exception to that. Yeah, go ahead. Somebody want to say something?
I do.
Yeah.
I think a good Jew is someone who has compassion for people,
Mhm.
who wants to take care of people well,
Okay,
especially their family.
right. You know, my question I frankly have difficulty with these questions, right? Because I mean, having compassion is a Jewish value, but it's not a uniquely Jewish value, right? Taking care of your family is a Jewish value. It's not a uniquely Jewish value,
Right.
right? So,
Right.
so that you know, Frank, and look, I mean, this is how I make my living, and I've been doing it for a long time. But I have difficulty with some of these questions sometimes. All right, so let me move on to a bit of a discussion about the book. Okay, so these are her chapter heads, right? And I mean, I would say before I tell you the chapter heading, I mean, her thesis, I would say, is that we learn something about how Jews viewed themselves over the history of the American Jewish community by who they considered to be bad Jews, right? Because if the converse of a bad Jew is a good Jew, right? And therefore, what does it mean to be a Jew? And what she says, this is undoubtedly true, is that Jewish identity is a complex phenomenon that is very, very malleable, right? I mean, it's not one thing, right? I mean, you know, let's throw out an example. And again, this is not to take sides politically, okay? But Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders, right? I mean, everybody knows that Bernie Sanders is a Jew, right? And nevertheless, he's completely non-observant, right? He's married to a non-Jewish woman. His son has no Jewish identity whatsoever. He is fairly high on AIPAC's enemies list, right? But if you ask Bernie Sanders, you know, why do you do the things that you do and believe in the things that you believe in? I have no doubt whatsoever that he will say it is because I've heard him say, right? It is because of his Jewish background. It is because of his Jewish values. It is because of what his family went through in Poland, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Is Bernie Sanders' Jewish identity my Jewish identity? Absolutely not, right? I mean, if all Jews had the type of, I mean, there's a guy who, you know, spent time, I mean, and not just a week, but several months in the early 60s living in Israel on a kibbutz, right? If all American Jews had the type of Jewish identity that Bernie Sanders had, I'd be out of a job because there'd be no shul, right? Bernie Sanders has absolutely no use for a shul, right? Without getting into the question of is Bernie Sanders a good Jew or a bad Jew, there's no doubt that he's a Jew and he has a Jewish identity and a strong Jewish identity. right? That is different than my Jewish identity, but I think no less sincere or strongly felt, right? So that there is no consensus in the American Jewish community about what it means to be a Jew, let alone a good Jew or a bad Jew, right? And Tamkin demonstrates that this is not a new phenomenon. It was always this way. I mean, I have to sometimes laugh, right? Because 90% of the American Jewish community claims that their grandparents were ultra Orthodox, right? Usually that they were ultra Orthodox, that their grandfather was not only Orthodox, but ultra Orthodox and a rabbi, right? 90% of American Jews have grandparents or great grandparents who were Orthodox rabbis.
Mhm.
And I have to laugh, right? Because if your family was part of the Great Migration from roughly 1890 to 1920, it is far more likely that they were socialist than that they were Orthodox, right? Far more likely, right? How many people remember their families reading the Forverts, right?
Yeah.
Okay, the Forverts was a socialist paper. Right? The Forverts was a socialist paper. Anybody remember their family reading the Morgan Freiheit?
Mhm.
No. Less widely circulated. Why? Because Morgan Freiheit was a communist paper. The but the Forverts was a socialist paper, and in the early 1900s, this astonished me from Tamkin's book. The Forverts had a bigger daily circulation than the New York Times. Okay, now to be fair, at the time in New York City, there weren't just 3 dailies, there were about a dozen. Okay, but there were also, I don't know, half a dozen Yiddish dailies, right? There was the Forwards, there was the Morgan Freiheit, the Morgan Journal, the Tug. There were a few, yeah, Maryland.
Many of our grandparents and great grandparents didn't read English. They wouldn't have
Right.
wanted to read the Times.
But I'm not saying it was just among the Jews. I'm
Oh,
saying
okay.
in general, there were more copies of the Forwards distributed every day than of the New York Times,
Mhm.
not just among Jews. So I know it's hard to believe, but there are actually a lot of non-Jews in New York City too. Um, now it's true that back then a lot of the non-Jews also read you, right? But or maybe didn't read it but spoke it. But but and if your grandparents only read Yiddish, didn't dictate that they had to read the Forward. There were other non-socialist papers as well. Right?
And my dad said that my grandmother always read it because it was a column, the Bintel Brief.
The Bintelbrief, right.
Yes.
It was an advice. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So these are her chapter headings: foreign Jews, white and red Jews, Zionist Jews, civil rights Jews, right-wing Jews, laboring Jews, refugee Jews, this land is our land Jews, and pushing Jews. Okay, and these are roughly in chronological order. All right, so she goes through how, a history of Jewish immigration, Jews who were communist or socialist, Zionism, the civil rights movement, the neoconservative movement, the Jewish labor movement, Russian and Iranian immigrants. This land is our land. Jews are like right wing on Israel. Then pushing Jews are the Jews who are, a younger group who are sort of less pro-Israel than Jews have tended to be. You know, one of the things, again, this is something that I knew because I wrote my master's thesis on a topic in American Zionism, right? But you know, Zionism was not really on the agenda of the American Jewish community until really, first of all, until the Nazis took over in Germany. I mean, prior to that, most American Jews were ambivalent, if not hostile, to Zionism, because of for all kinds of reasons, but primarily because of the fear of the dual loyalty accusation, right? And that it was hard enough to be accepted as truly American without loyalty to some other foreign cause, right? But when the Nazis took over and the gates of America were pretty much closed, right? I mean, we all know that story, right? We know about the St. Louis, and we know how few Jews were admitted, even, you know, when Germany was willing to let Jews emigrate, but there was nobody that there was nowhere that they could go. And the British had pretty much closed the gates of Palestine. So there was an acceptance of Zionism as a need for a place of refuge, right? Where there would be one piece of land where I think it was Robert Frost's definition of home, a place where when you have to go there, they have to let you in. And there was no such place, right? And I mean, and coincidentally, this is one of the reasons why, frankly, among those who follow this stuff, there's so much concern about the likely new government in Israel wanting to change the law of return, right? And exclude non-Orthodox converts, because right now the law of return says if you have one Jewish grandparent, you can make Aliyah. And the parties, not Netanyahu's parties, but the parties to his right, want to get rid of that and say, you know, you have to have one Jewish parent, not one Jewish grandparent. You know, and then it wasn't really until 1967, after the 6-Day War, that Israel became like central to the American Jewish agenda, right? I mean, if you look at, for example, I mean, when I learned Hebrew with an Israeli pronunciation, right? Most of you looking around are older than I am, right? And how many of you learned Hebrew with an Israeli pronunciation? I did. Nobody, right? You all learned it with an Ashkenazi pronunciation, right? Well, when did that change take place? It took place after the 6-Day War. Okay, when did schools start having Israeli as well as American flags on the pulpit? After the 6-Day War. Right, and it's not, I mean, so particularly the Hebrew pronunciation, for sure that was tied to Israel, right? But you know, other things, the rise of Jewish studies, the comfort that people had wearing kippot in public. I mean, again, I remember because I was born in 1960, right? And we had very close Orthodox friends lived across the hallway from us in our apartment building in Brooklyn. And Mr. Line One never wore a kippah to go to work. He was an accountant, and he never wore a kippah to go to work. It was unheard of, right? I mean, maybe Hasidim wore kippot all the time, but regular modern Orthodox Jews, you wore a kippah at home, you wore it in shul. You didn't wear it to go to work or to go to school. It just wasn't something that people did. But it's not only Israel, but it's also, frankly, the rise of the Black Pride movement in the late 60s that made ethnicity more comfortable and diversity more comfortable, and the rise, like I said, of Jewish studies in colleges and so on and so forth is all tied to that as well. One of the things that I found interesting in the book, and some of this I knew, but not in the depth to which she went into, was the question of Jews as white people. Okay, now I have to obviously point out that when we deal with the question of Jews as white, we're talking about who? We're talking about European descended Ashkenazi Jews, right? There are Black Jews, there are Asian Jews, there are Latino Jews, there are Jews, there are Jews in all Jews, and we don't even know, but let's say 80 to 90% of the American Jewish community are Ashkenazi European descended Jews, right? And the question of whether they were white, okay, and this is a continuing topic of controversy, right? But there were times in American history where there were real legal implications to the question of whether Jews were considered white or not, right? Because you had laws that allowed only white people to immigrate, right? And
Rabbi,
therefore, Jews could not immigrate if they were not considered white, right? You had laws that excluded, for example, Japanese and Chinese, right? Well, if you accept the assertion that Jews originate in Eretz Yisrael, what continent is Eretz Yisrael in? Asia, right? So, and there was even a bill in Congress that said that the prohibition of Asiatic immigration does not apply to Jews, Syrians, or Armenians, right? And the Jewish community was up in arms, okay, because they didn't want an exception to the ban on Asiatic immigration. They wanted to be considered white, right? Because it mattered. Rabbi Goldman, you have something you want to say or ask?
in the book, The Conversion of Chaplain Cohen, he's in Gandor Air Base, and he invites a Black Jew to his Seder, and he gets in trouble for that.
Right.
So,
Right. No, look, there's always been, as I said, Black Jews, Asian Jews, whatever, right? But that's not, these debates over the racial, the whiteness or non-whiteness of Jews is really talking about, Ashkenazi Jews. Right. So, and the fact of the matter is that the whiteness of Jews has gone back and forth, right? Because for a long time, Italians were not considered white either, right? And this was, an anti-immigrant type of thing. Although I found this was a fascinating sort of historical tidbit, is that the first Jew elected to Congress, who was elected in the 1840s by the name of Levine, was one of the founders of the Know Nothing Party. That blew my mind. But so the question of Jews as whites, there's a complicated and interesting history. All right. She also has in her chapter on Jews and the Civil Rights Movement, and I should mention, by the way, that Tamkin, she is the Washington correspondent for the New Statesman, which is a very left-wing British publication. Okay, so and to her credit, she does not hide her prejudice, right? And certainly I have to say, if I'm reading a book by somebody and their left-wing orientation makes me uncomfortable, that's pretty left-wing, okay? But it did make me uncomfortable at times. But she spoke about Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. And, this tied in with some of my own family history that, as much as Jews were pro-civil rights, Jews were also part of the great white flight out of the cities, right? And my own family is a perfect example. My dad came from a very strong union background. My mom came from a very strong union background. My mom was a teacher and she was very active in her own teachers union. But we moved from Brooklyn to New Jersey in 1968. And there was a point not that long ago when I looked back and I said, oh my God, right? We were part of the great white flight from New York City. We were, right? And I'm sure, I can't ask my parents now, right? But I'm sure if I asked them, they would say, oh, it's because we wanted good schools, right? Nobody ever says, we don't want to live with Black people. We don't want to live with Latinos. They say we want good schools for our kids, right? There's really no reason why schools that are predominantly Black or predominantly Latino can't be good, right? But our society has also determined not, from my perspective, not to devote those resources. But Jews and certainly in around here. When did the JCC move to the JCC in Rockville or North Bethesda?
Rockville.
Right. I know it used to be Rockville. I think it's now North Bethesda, even though the JCC hasn't moved. Right. But I think it was like 69 that the JCC moved to Montrose Road, right? It was still called Montrose Road in 69, right? And of course, the story of the DC JCC is in and of itself very interesting, right? Because a bunch of people got together and bought back the original JCC in DC. Right, but the institutions of the Jewish community relocating out to the suburbs, I mean, it says something, frankly, and part of what it says, in my opinion, is not, necessarily all that positive. But and then so she has chapter on Jews and support for Israel, and again, I mean, I think for most American Jews of a certain age, right, support for Israel is kind of like basic, right? I mean, obviously it depends on how you define support for Israel, right? And that becomes more complicated. And it's going to become even more complicated with the new government in Israel, right? Because the new government in Israel stands for things that I guarantee you most American Jews find completely anathema. All right. I mean, we believe that Israel should be a Jewish state and a democracy. Frankly, many of the parties in the new government do not believe that they believe it should be an ethnic democracy. That is to say, full equal rights for all Jewish citizens of Israel. Right. But 20% of the citizens of Israel are not Jewish. Well, what about them? Lo hashuv. But I mean, I remember a few years ago attending the American Jewish Committee's Global Forum. It was the first time I ever heard Hakeem Jeffries. In fact, it was the first time I ever heard of Hakeem Jeffries. And it was very reassuring to me how pro-Israel he is. That kind of support for Israel is kind of like basic. And I could never, I mean, when I moved here, right? When I moved here, this district was still represented by Donna Edwards, although she was on her way out and John Delaney was on his way in. And I was like, oh my God, Donna Edwards is my representative, because she had a very strong relationship as somebody who's anti-Israel. I mean, and in my opinion, a deserved relationship for being anti-Israel. Support for Israel is kind of basic within a sort of, broad tent framework. I mean, you can certainly, I think supportive of Israel, but opposed to certain policies of the Israeli government, and still be considered pro-Israel. But for a younger generation, that is not a given at all. And it's problematic, I think. The last thing, I mean, she has a chapter on Jewish support for Trump. Now, interestingly, I mean, the book was published before Trump had his famous dinner with Kanye West and Nick Fuentes. I don't want to go into it too much. I mean, for a long time, and many of you had heard me say this, I said, I don't believe Trump is an anti-Semite. And I'm still not sure that he's actually an anti-Semite. But he clearly doesn't mind support of anti-Semites or weaponizing and using anti-Semitism to advance his political fortunes, right? I mean, I think, we saw that with the statement in Charlotte, oh, very fine people on both sides. And so I think, like I said, you know, um, his support for Kanye West and whatever, I think, is really gives one a reason to wonder whether he is in fact an anti-Semite. Although I don't think it really matters. I mean, in a certain sense. I mean, what you do is more important than what you say. And finally, the last thing, which I thought was really worth bringing to your attention. So she is a member of Temple Sinai, in not no Temple Micah in D.C. On Wisconsin Avenue near the National Cathedral. And she writes a lot about her own Jewish identity. Her mother is a convert to Judaism, and therefore, when she was growing up, people challenged whether she was really Jewish, blah, 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 blah. And now she is married to a non-Jewish man, an Indian American. But she writes, and I have no reason to gainsay it, that her own sense of Jewish identity is very strong and got stronger as she was researching the book, even as so much of what she said about the Jewish community is really critical. But she asked her own rabbi, Rabbi Danny Zemel. I don't know if any of you know him. I know him. For his definition of a bad Jew. And I found it really interesting. According to Tamkin, what Rabbi Zemel said is a bad Jew is somebody who doesn't recall that the Torah begins with the creation of Adam and Eve. Right, which I found really, really interesting, right? Because it's not just the story of the Jews, it's the story of all humanity, right? And I don't know, I mean, Rabbi Zemel was certainly aware of this. I don't know that Tamkin is aware of this, but I've spoken about this, that Rashi's first comment on Genesis 1:1 raises the question of why the Torah has to begin with creation, right? Because after all, the Torah is merely the law book of the Jews. And therefore, everything prior to Exodus 12 is superfluous. He raises, and then he rejects that. He rejects that because he says, no, it is intended for all humanity, right? There's a teleology, there's a purpose behind it. It's not just a book of laws, right? But therefore, I mean, if I were to offer a Perush, an interpretation on Rabbi Zemel's statement, right, that a Jew who is concerned only with Jews is not a good Jew, right? The flip side is that a Jew who is not at all concerned with Jews is also not a good Jew, right? That our identity has to be sort of balanced, and we have to pay attention to, and it goes back to Hillel, right? If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am for myself only, what am I? Right? And that's really the needle that we kind of have to thread. All right. So I spoke more than I wanted to, but less than I usually do. So again, if there are any questions or comments, please go right ahead. No? Anyone? Yeah, Stan.
So what is your definition of a good Jew and a bad Jew?
Well, I agree with I mean I agree with Zemmel's definition. I mean, I would say, I mean, here's the thing, right? Is that to a certain extent, I have a problem with the terminology because, all right, let's look at bad Jew. Bad Jew is too often weaponized, right? I mean, who is a bad Jew? Somebody who doesn't agree with me, right? I mean, for example, she started off, I didn't mention this, but since you asked the question, I will. I didn't mention it because I forgot it, but you reminded me. She started out with a tweet from Ben Shapiro from 2011, where Ben Shapiro said, throughout its history, the Jews have been plagued by bad Jews, that is to say, Jews who hurt the Jewish people. Today, most of those bad Jews vote for the Democrats. Right? Right. I mean, we weaponize the term, right? And certainly, I mean, the flip side is if I had $1 for every time I've heard somebody say that if you voted for Trump, you're a bad Jew, I'd have quite a few dollars. I wouldn't necessarily be rich, but I'd have a few dollars, right? I don't necessarily buy that. I mean, so I think the weaponization of that term bad Jew makes it kind of meaningless, right? Because like a bad Jew is somebody whose Judaism I don't agree with and I don't like. I tend not to use the term good Jew. I tend to actually use the term serious Jew, right? That I think that there are people who are serious Jews and people who are not serious Jews. Okay, and by serious Jew, I mean somebody who is involved in some way in Jewish life, even if it is a form of Jewish life that is not my form. It is somebody who identifies and throws their lot in with the Jewish people for good or for ill, right? I mean, somebody who can say, well, the Jews aren't doing what I want them to do, so I quit, right? I quit the Jews. Somebody who observes Jewish practices, again, even if it's not the same way that I do, who studies Jewish texts, again, even if it's not the same way that I do. So I tend to shy away from the term good Jew and serious Jew, which I mean, admittedly is still judgmental, but I think it is actually less judgment. I think it's less judgmental than good Jew because it is a broader tent for sure. So that's my answer to your question, Stan. Okay. Anyone else? All right. If not, then good night and Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Yasher Koach. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi.
See ya.
Very
Thank you,
interesting.
Rabbi.
Thanks.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.